Last time we learned Pei Dal Tetzval, Halacha Tetzval. This unusual din, it's up there on the screen here. That said, let's read the din again, because then we'll get into a different angle of it. Okay, it says, Mini Oifres Hagedelum Be'ilan, V'tui Be'ilan B'char Teleim, Asur Mishim Sheretz Asheres Halaretz. So we spoke about last time is that there's a shaila in Rishayna about this bird. Should we treat this bird, it grows from a tree, should we treat it as a fruit, as a bird, or as sheretz? Okay, that was the shaila in Rishayna, and the Shulchan Aruch is telling us that it's a sheretz. So we spoke about it, and we actually found what to learn from this, even though it's a very unusual din, and no one sort of knows what it's talking about. But in the interim, since then, I sort of was working on it from before, but I've gotten some more information. We have a thought as to what the bird might be that the Shulchan Aruch is describing. Okay, the information we're going to talk about comes from different places, but the direction that I got to this was from some ornithologists, okay, which is people who study birds. And I said to them, I read an old book. I didn't tell them it was a Shulchan Aruch. I said, I'm reading an old book that describes a bird that does like this. I told them I read these old books that describes this bird. Do you know what it's talking about? Does that mean anything to you? And they pretty quickly told me, yeah, of course you know what he's talking about. Of course you know. That they knew what I was talking about. Okay? And they said, this is the bird that we're talking about. Okay? It's called the Barnacle Goose, not to be confused with a goose barnacle. Okay? It's a Barnacle Goose. Okay? So, no, really, there is such thing as a barnacle. What?
Barnacle. The green sticks of the ships, right there.
Right. So it's a Barnacle Goose, not a goose barnacle. Okay, what's a goose barnacle? It's a nice looking goose.
How do I think that's a sheretz?
That's a good question. It's a very good question. So it's a Barnacle Goose. And what's with this bird? This bird lives in northern England and Ireland, okay, which is a pretty cold area. And this bird disappears for the summers. Okay? In the summers, this bird disappears because, okay, we're now a little theorizing, but it gets too warm in those cold places, and it goes to the Arctic for the summer. Okay, so it spends the summers in the Arctic, and the winters in these colder places in the top of, like England, Ireland over there, on the top there, for those of you with your geography, in the top there. And people who saw this bird living in those places never saw the bird lay any eggs, never saw any babies being hatched. And that was because, we now know, that was because the bird lays its eggs in the Arctic, okay, where nobody was. Okay, so they saw this bird the whole winter, they saw this bird flying around, and they saw baby versions of it, but they never saw eggs being laid and being hatched. Okay, so, and all kinds of other reasons for what happened is that became a belief, a strong held belief in the Middle Ages, that this bird came out of a tree. Okay, this bird, and it's called a barnacle goose, like David said, because barnacles, which grow on the bottom of ships, grow on wood. There was a lot of similarities between what barnacles look like and the babies of these geese, and they said that they come from trees. Okay, it was a widely held belief, to the point that there were even lots of people who cited seeing them coming out of trees. All kinds, you'll see in a second. All kinds of people who saw them. We actually saw them coming out of the tree, and they're popping off. I mean, it was actually even over here. Okay, here's a picture from 1552. Okay, of them coming out of the tree. Now, this is not a snapshot. This is the guy's drawing of his imagination, what it looks like. But we get lots of people who tell you that they saw it, and they wrote it, and they saw it coming out of the tree, the whole spiel. You know what I mean? The whole to do. Okay, these words are too small. Okay, but I don't know if you could read it. From pining floating in the water and close their shell, they hang and... Okay, we'll skip the beach for a second. Okay, so then there's a thing called I hope I'm pronouncing this right. A bestiary. Okay, a bestiary. I don't know if I'm saying this right either, but a bestiary is like, you have a dictionary. Okay, you know what a dictionary is? So a bestiary is a book about beasts. Okay, and it seems that in the Middle Ages these were popular bestiaries, and bestiaries were, and what they did is they built on each other. One guy wrote one, and then 300 years later somebody else wrote one. He took the last guy's thing and he added on. He was money, so then he added it on. Okay, so they collected information. So now you can get this online now. And in this one from the 1200s, okay, from the 1200s, he tells you, look what he writes. Okay, the barnacle geese come from trees that grow over water. They make birds that look like small geese. They hang from their beaks from the trees. And when they're mature enough, they fall down. And there's a whole Torah here. If they fall over here, then they live. And these ones will fall over here. These are the Chaim Leaving Mars. They have a whole Torah over here of how the bird how it functions. Okay, and that description sounds very much like what Shulchan Aruch said, and that's why these ornithologists, when I asked them, did you ever hear of such a bird? They said, of course, it's Pasha. That's what it's talking about. If you read an old book about that, that's what they think about. Okay, and now, from that same book, from this Bodleian Library bestiary, okay, it has diagrams. These bestiary, now I've come to learn, are full of pictures, okay, and here they are. Here are the birds hanging from their beaks. Tluyim, what was the word in Shulchan Aruch? Tluyim be'ilim b'chayim tameim. There they are, hanging from the trees, okay? Mamish, in living color, the guy's imagination of how these birds
are. It does actually look like they're... Your explanation, the explanation that they never sort of had babies. Why would they make up that it hang from the beaks? Must be they hang like that.
Maybe
why make that up?
I don't know. It's part of this whole myth of what used to go on with these birds. I'm not convinced that that's the truth.
Really? You just sit on a bird like any other bird? Sit on a tree like any other bird?
They're a bunch of geese. Anyhow, and here's another one. Here's another one from different bestiary.
These things are all around. If they
I'm not going to see them now.
They didn't go extinct, did they?
No, they're still around.
So if they really hang from their beaks, they should have changed their behavior.
Right. I'm my impression that they don't, but I don't. I'm not an ornithologist. That's my impression. I don't. Okay. So, I mean, these. When I'm telling you, that's an ornithologist. They were like Pashtuns, and that's what I'm reading about, and it fits with what we're reading. Okay. And there's something called the Jewish Encyclopedia. Encyclopedia is how Jewish it is. We can talk about that. The Jewish Encyclopedia printed in 1906. Okay, and it has a long entry on. The entry is called Barnacle Goose or Barnacle Geese, and it has a long entry. And in this entry, it talks all about this bird. Okay, this bird, and it brings you a long list of Rishonim, more than I saw. Long list of Rishonim who are talking about the Shaila. Okay, he connects this into that Shaila. He's got lots of mistakes in there. I mean, loads of things that are not accurate, but that's okay. Including, I don't have to say all the copy courses that's in there, and all kinds of things that are inaccurate. But it got a pile. No. It's called the Jewish Encyclopedia. It was printed in 1906. It's available online. JewishEncyclopedia.com. Anybody wants to go look at it. And it's full of. Encyclopedia Judaica has a drop, like it has pulled out something from there. But these guys have a whole shtickle Torah about it. In fact, in one of the quotes, in this quote, I think it's in this quote, one of the quotes that I have up here, maybe it's the one before him, after the guy quotes his whole spiel about Barnacle Geese, it then goes into a whole religious piece about it. About this bird turned into a whole religious figure. Okay, it was whatever. We don't need to talk about it. Okay, whatever. They had a whole to do about it. You keep on reading more about it, you find out what they thought about it.
Christianity?
Yeah, they had a whole whatever. Yeah. Okay, so what are we going to say? So
it took discovered that they don't grow on trees.
I don't know. Recently, maybe 100 years ago, 150 years ago, it was not until very recently people thought that was.
They didn't believe spontaneous. Before Baldwin.
We mean went together with that.
They didn't believe spontaneous generation. They must have had a thirst for this. So.
Maybe okay.
At least that long ago.
So no. What was appalling to me is how many people write that they actually saw it happening. Okay? These are people writing official history books or histories or whatever. They're writing this.
You don't hear the midnight radio shows with the UFO spotting?
Right, that's what I'm saying. But so then we turn to these books and we say, look, this is authoritative. It tells you what really happened.
Well, maybe that's some sort of behavior where they do that.
They give birth in the Arctic.
I know.
They don't give birth any place where anybody can see them.
I understand, but from not knowing that, the way that their behavior was, they might have observed that behavior, or they might not have understood it properly, but they might have observed it.
Okay. It just okay. So you're being nicer. So we'll say is when we read people's description of something that's happening, they might not be trying to lie to us, but they may have just totally missed the boat. They missed the boat.
They could have seen that happening.
They saw something that they imagined to be like that.
I'm saying maybe they saw. It's just like if you leave a piece of meat out and it gets all wormy, right? So we know that it's not because it's spontaneous generation. But back then, when you don't know all about spores and stuff, so it makes sense. So when they describe spontaneous generation, like what they were seeing was true. The reason behind it wasn't. So
what exactly were they seeing, though?
So I have no idea. If people are testifying that they saw they seen these birds falling out of trees, so obviously they fell out of trees.
Okay. So anyhow, so so if we don't know if this is the truth, if that's really what Shulchan was talking about, it sure sounds like a good candidate, just better than anything we had last week.
What is the Shulchan again?
The Shulchan is just first slide. It's the first slide.
I mean, Ovis isn't limited to birds.
What do you say?
An oaf is not limited to birds.
What's the cartoon they have?
They're
Halachos.
beaks. They're beaks.
Huh?
What else? What is it? What else would it be?
Other flying beaks are oafs, can't they?
Well, that's what it is. That's what birds are. Birds are things that fly.
I'm saying bats, I think, are considered birds, aren't they?
Animals.
No, the mammals.
Okay.
Halacha
Back to so the
oaf doesn't necessarily mean a bird.
so let's just say like this. Assuming that if this is what the Shulchan was talking about, so the Shulchan was presented with a shiloh. It's a lot of Rishonim were talking about this. Who presented with a shiloh? What do we have about this bird who has this and this behavior? To which they answered the shiloh. Okay, whether the fact that the truth didn't exist, that the bird isn't what they described, doesn't take away from you asked me the shiloh. Should I treat this as a fruit or a bird or a sheretz? So they said if you had such a bird, you would treat it as either a fruit or a bird or a sheretz. Okay, it's not a Gemara saying this is the truth. You told me this Metzias. This is the Metzias. You have a bird that does this and this and this. So then I'll respond to you that either it's a bird or a fruit or a sheretz, like that. Okay, just to throw in a little bit, the Maril that we spoke about last week, who talks about seemingly what everybody else is talking about, in the Maril that I have from Mechon Yerushalayim, it has different girsas. And one of the girsas is that he doesn't call it a bird, he calls it an avaz, which would fit with this. It's a goose. Okay, an avaz is a goose. The problem is that, if you remember, we talked about that the Marils comparing, the person who gets shayla was, how does this compare to a mosquito? Or to what we translate as a yiter, so we translate as a mosquito, and why is this a sheretz and this is a bird? So we were looking at the Maril for his hezbollah, as what the difference between a sheretz and an oif is, but if this is what he's talking about, it's really hard to imagine anybody having a question, right? I mean, you look at this thing and you look at a mosquito, you don't, like, sort of not a, if you looked at a hummingbird and you looked at a mosquito, I could see you making a comparison. You say, what's the difference? A hummingbird is just a big mosquito. I mean, in a certain sense. But I don't know how you could think that this thing over here, that this is a mosquito. Somehow it doesn't, I don't see the shot. Okay, so maybe we're missing it. Maybe they're talking about something else. So we had something to learn from the Maril anyhow. Okay, one more thing about this din before we go on. The Maril, as I mentioned, we use it as a source to understand the difference between a bird and a sheretz. I saw afterwards there's a Tosfos in Chulin on Samach Beis and Beis. The Pri Chodesh brings it, who actually talks about, he thinks it's a Gemara that talks about big birds and little birds. That little birds and shrotzim. That when at a certain point the bird goes from being a bird to being a sheretz. It doesn't explain what the difference is. The Gemara just says, I don't have the words of the Gemara in front of me. The Gemara says, describes two different things. Rashi learns that it's talking about two different kinds of grasshoppers, and Tosfos learns that no, it's two kinds of birds. Okay, two variations, and it's like it'll tell you like a cutoff. This variation is the bird, and this one is the sheretz. So Tosfos doesn't tell you what it is. It doesn't tell you what the criteria is. But the Gemara there, according to Tosfos, is telling us this is like a cutoff point between birds and shrotzim. So maybe if we knew what that Gemara was talking about, Lefi Tosfos, we would have a better understanding than for this thing we saw in the Maril of what is the cutoff? What's the difference between a mosquito, like Maril said, what's the difference between a mosquito and a bird? How do you cut off between one and the other? Okay, let's go on. For the next thing, you can look at them if you want to. But the next thing is what's the
psak halacha?
The psak. So no, I forgot one thing. I'm sorry. One more thing.
Now, once we know what it is,
wait, one more thing. No. So to answer yes, what we talked about last time, we said, that's how we're coming to. We had said last time is that for us, what would be the nafkamina? Even if we found the bird that the Shulchan was talking about, that it's a bird, the Shulchan says it's a sheretz. Even if those Rishonim thought that it was if you hold it's a fruit, of course you can eat it. But if you hold that it's a sheretz, a bird, we can't eat it anyhow because we have no Masera. This is going to answer the kasha, because it could be they looked at this and they said it's a duck, it's a goose. They looked at it and I'm saying we're not talking about that whole shiloh, but it can sein the reason why when some held that you could eat it b'shchita is because they looked at it and said basically it's a black goose. Okay, they just that's a big shiloh. How do you know whether one guy was like
a knife and said you can eat it?
Yeah, the one that says it's mutar b'shchita. So it could be that they hold you didn't even Masara, but we don't have to say that. Because it could be that if we would see this, we would say, so it's a black and white goose. Big deal. Just another goose. Instead of a green goose.
So must be goes to you don't need to exactly say it.
So again, we're not talking about that right. There's a big to-do. How do you know what the difference in one goose? I mean, to me, most all birds are the same. You know? There's got to be a way to be malkid. This is this bird, this is that bird. It's not just a big bird and a little bird. You know. Okay, let's go. Halacha Tezayin is I don't know if I'm gonna. I'll probably end up reading the whole thing. It's a very long din. It's a din that became very famous in the past few years. Okay, it's a din about worms in animals and fish. Okay, so I'm gonna, if you don't scream at me, 2 years ago, when the whole tumult was really in its peak, we had a share about that shiloh by itself. So we're not going to go over that thing. Okay, what we're going to do is, so we're going to read this. Could you imagine that in this day and age, I could read this din and not tell you about? I'm going to tell you a little bit about worms and fish, but we'll talk about just a din as a din per se, without talking about Anisakis. Okay, if we have some, I'm going to read the din. You'll listen. Okay, I'm going to give you an introduction, and then we won't read. Okay, it's a Gemara. It's a Gemara in Samach Simon base, and the Gemara says like this: if you find a worm in the intestines of an animal, that worm is usher. Why? Because it can say that the worm came in from the outside. If it came in from the outside, on the outside it was sheretz al aretz. Then it crawled its way into the animal. So now the animal's in the animal's intestines. So it's usher because Kenzain came from the outside. That's a simple reason why it's usher. What happens if you find the worm in the flesh of the animal? Of the animal? So then the din is, the Gemara says it for sure didn't come from the outside. The Gemara says minei gavli. It grows from the word Rashi. The word gavli means gadli. It grows from the inside. It grew from the inside. For sure didn't come from the outside. So sheretz, it's a sheretz that was sheretz al earth. It's for sure not. If for sure it's not sheretz al earth, it's not an usher as a sheretz. But this worm that's in there has a hybrid status. It's like in between. It's considered an independent being, because it is independent. It doesn't need the animal to live on. I mean, it eats the animal, but it doesn't need the animal. It's an independent being. But on the other hand, it's considered part of the animal. It grew in the animal's flesh. It's part of the animal. So it has this hybrid status. And when I say that as a hybrid, it means like this. When the animal dies, this worm that's in there is considered Evrim and Achai. It's considered part of the animal that you're not allowed to eat it because it's Evrim and Achai. It's considered part of the animal. But when you shech the animal, it doesn't become mutter. An Evrim and Achai, the animal's foot, when you shech it, you can't eat it when it's alive because it's Evrim and Achai. When you shech the animal, it becomes mutter. But the worm that's in there is part of the animal to the extent that it's also as Evrim and Achai. It's part of the animal. But it's independent, and therefore when you shech the animal, the shechita doesn't help for this worm, and the worm stays usher. Okay, so the worm has the worst of both worlds. Okay, it's usher no matter what. Before you shech it, after you shech it doesn't make the originality. And Rashi over there compares this worm to a ben pekur. A ben pekur is also similar, that it has an independent life, so to speak. There it's really totally on the mother, but it's considered to have an independent life, but it's part of the animal. So a ben pekur is not, in theory, would not become mutter with the mother shechita. It would be asar as Evrim Achai, except for Gzeres HaKosov. Gzeres HaKosov, that the ben pekur is mutter. If not for the Gzeres HaKosov, the ben pekur we would say it's Evrim Achai because it's part of the mother. It's not mutter with the mother shechita, and the male it's asar. It happens to be the Gzeres HaKosov. Good, there's a Gzeres HaKosov for a ben pekur. There's no Gzeres HaKosov for worms in the meat, so it's asar. What would happen? So all this we're talking about is when there's a worm that's in the intestines or the flesh from when the animal was alive. What would happen if there was a worm in the flesh that came in after the animal died? Okay, like maggots. Okay, they came in after the animal died. So then that's not Evrim and Achai. That didn't come from a living thing. That came in afterwards. It's like it came in a potato. It has nothing to do with it being a living thing. And therefore, the simple understanding is that bug would be mutter, because it was never perished. It grew in the flesh, like we're saying, it grows in the flesh. It grew there in the flesh, it was never perished, and it would be mutter. Okay, you'll see, if we get that far in the Shulchan Aruch, there's a Shitas Rambam that's usher also. That worm is usher also. We don't pass on that, and we're not going to go to it. So it's a whole to-do by itself, but the Rambam holds about the worms that come into the flesh after the animal dies. One more thing about that is, there's another question about this, and the worms that come in after the animal dies, having to do with whether they perish after the animal dies, or perish after they die. That has to do with Halacha Dal. We spoke about it, so I'm not going to talk about that. There's a shach about it here. There's seemingly a steeper between Halacha Dal and Halacha Tezayin about that. Okay. So now we talk about the meat. But now when we go to the fish, it's the same mitzias, but the din is very different. Okay, the mitzias is, if you find the worm in the intestines of the fish, then the worm is usher. Because Kenzain came in from the outside, it was sheretz and it's usher. What happens if the worm is in the flesh? then again, it's this in between an independent being and part of the fish. But in the fish, there's no din of Eivim and Achai. There's no issue of Eivim and Achai in the fish, and the Mela, the worm is mutter. Okay, it's considered part of the fish. Okay, part of the fish is mutter. Being part of the fish is not anything usher. It was never sheretz al haaretz, and it's part of the fish, so it's mutter. It's not Eivim and Achai, and it's fine. Okay, what I just said to you, which is we're going to now read a long version in Shulchan Aruch, or maybe we won't read it. The Shulchan Aruch says is a repeat of this is a Gemara. Okay, the Pri Megadim says, when I told you that the animal, the worm in the meat is a Eivim and Achai, he has two nafkaminas for being Eivim and Achai. Okay, he's just going through the din. He says, now that the Gemara says that it's Eivim and Achai, so it has two nafkaminas for that din. Two unexpected nafkaminas. He says, first of all, what would happen if there was a worm in the flesh of a ben pekua? He says, so a ben pekua has no din of Eivim and Achai. Ben pekua is mutter. There's not Eivim and Achai in a ben pekua. You have to wait for it to die, whatever. But it has really no din of Eivim and Achai. So if there was a worm in the flesh of a ben pekua, you would be allowed to eat it. It wouldn't be Eivim and Achai. The whole issue is worms in the flesh of meat is Eivim and Achai. In a ben pekua, it's Eivim and Achai. So you could eat. Okay, that's one thing he says.
Do you understand it?
What?
Do you understand it?
Why don't I understand it?
Why is it better than the mother itself?
So you're saying is, if the worm had been in the mother's foot, we would have said it's Eivim and Achai. Now that it's in the mother's ben pekua, it's not Eivim and Achai.
Look at a ben pekua as being part of the mother from the Gabi Shchita.
But yeah, because it starts on the Chai, like the behemoth. The behemoth also didn't have Eivim and Achai before the Shchita. The mother. Right?
So now that we did the shchita was matir.
But why is it? So the Gabi Shchita, the pekua is like part of the mother. It's little with the mother. So the worm can't be better than it would be in the mother itself.
No, you're missing one part of that sentence. The ben pekua, even though it has independent life, is given the status of the mother.
Right.
The fact that it's independent doesn't make a difference. Right. So this worm is part of that ben pekua. You want to say, it's independent of the independent thing. It's like another.
Ben pekua is considered to be part of the mother that's an intimate sheet of the mother. But the worm in the mother is still awesome.
No, we had the ben pekua. It was not in the ben pekua before the shchita. He's talking afterwards. This guy ben pekua is running around.
I actually didn't mean. Oh, I didn't mean. Maybe that's a shot. Maybe that's what the people mean. But that's not. I meant that it was in there from before. Oh, you're saying. Okay, now I got it. You're right. You're probably right. Your kasha is if it was in the ben pekua when he was inside the mother, right. Then it should be. Eivim and Achai the mother, and you're answering that what the people meant was that if it grew in the ben pekua after he was born, so that this animal was ready. It's an animal. It's like a dead animal. It's like a dead animal. What happens if there's a worm in the meat of dead? Okay, that's a good answer. So you're saying the people. We'll have to look inside to make sure he really says that. But you're saying is it came into the flesh of the ben pekua after he was born. So Mamelo, he came in afterwards. So this is an animal that had a very shchita. It's a dead animal. As far as we're concerned, it's dead. So it's like when you find worms in dead animals, okay, good answer. Good question, good answer. Okay. And the other nafkamina that Pri Megadim says is, he says is that since a goy is usher to eat Eivim and Achai, you're not allowed to give meat that has a worm in it to a goy. You're not allowed to eat, of course, because it's Eivim and Achai. But Eivim and Achai is usher to a goy, so it's usher l'hosher to a goy, the meat that has in it the worm inside of it. Okay? I guess it's not with the either, but whatever it is. So you can't give him the meat that has the worm inside of it. So in case you open up a trade restaurant, you have to keep that in mind.
You can even give him ben pekua.
Could you what?
You can even give him
because he has no heter of.
And then I had to shchita.
Right. Okay. That's another reason why. There was a big to-do that they should have ben pekua farms, right? So that's another reason why they shouldn't have them, because it would be only kosher for yidden, it would be treif for goy. So it'd say kosher and the guy would eat it. Okay. It was a whole to-do. Okay. Go ahead. Okay. One more thing is that I said to you that I mentioned in passing when I kept passing by it. It's Pri Megadim who says it, who speaks it out, that the worms that are inside the intestines of the fish are not asur mivadai. They're not asur because they for sure came from the outside. It's only a soft that they came from the outside. They could have just as well grown on the inside. He said no reason why worms can't grow in fish intestines just like they grow in fish flesh. He says so it could be good from the inside, but being as it could come from the outside, memela it's soft. It's asur misafik. Okay. Okay, let's quickly read the Shulchan Aruch. It's a very long din. I don't know if you have the patience with me. I'll read it quickly. Okay. Call Tolan Hanim Tzorim Behema. If you find worms in an animal, Bein Or Labasar, Bein Shem B'Miyayim, whether it's between the hide and the flesh, or in the B'Miyayim, it's Asurim, and that's because either they're Ever Nachai, or they're from the outside. Either way, they're Asurim. V'Tzorim B'Dagim B'Miyayim, Asurim. If they're found in the stomach of the fish, they're Asur. Bein Or Labasar or B'Say Chabasar Mutarim. Well, if they're between the skin and the flesh, or inside the flesh, then they're Mutar, because they grew from inside. And the Ramos sticks in about few Pirshu Ksas v'Chazru, even if they went out a little bit and came back in their mutter, it's considered Hagoshai Ridur. This is an important thing if we get to it for a second about the Anisakis. Okay, so that even if they go out a little bit, until it's pirish completely, it's not considered that it was pirish. Now, the Machaber says, this that we say that it's usher to eat the worms in flesh of meat, that's the ones that came into the animal while it was alive. The ones that grow in meat after the shechita, or the ones that grow in things that are not living at all. They grow in fish or in cheese. Mutar and cause marsh like pirshu. Their mutar, as long as they stay inside, they would like pirish because they would never share its alarms. Therefore, worms that are found on a plate that fell out of the meat, meaning they fell out of the meat. They're the kinds of worms that came into the meat after it died, and then they fell onto your plate, mutarim. And this is the question of the Mechaber seems to be saying that Pirshu Mesu is mutter, and that's to do with the Halacha Dal, whether it's a Shaila in Halacha Dal. That's a Matirim. According to the Matirim, not according to the Rambam. Okay, I told you, we'll read in a second, the Mechaber is going to say the Rambam holds that if it came in La'achar Misa, it's Asur also. So that's a Matirim, means according to most people make. We don't have to be cautious. They came out while they were alive. The ones that came out while they were alive were washed off from the meat when you wash the meat. Okay, now comes the Rambam. The Rambam holds that if the worms come in even after shechita into an animal, it's also. Okay, the Rambam says we'll make like the first part that if it came in after misa, it's mutter. Okay, the Rambam continues. We have another minhag about the taloim in cheese. Even though they're jumping all around on the cheese, and as you see, the guy picks up a piece of cheese, and there's worms jumping all around on his cheese, you're allowed to eat them. Because, the reason is because as long as they were like pirshu, they would never share or it's a mutter. The fact that they're moving around within the cheese, that's their habitat. That's from the beginning, way at the beginning of the simon, that's their habitat, and it's not a problem. Avon pirshu l'gamri, if they completely left the cheese, asur, oisur, then they're asur. Miu, in this arvu b'shar ma'echel, what happens if they left the cheese and they got mixed into other foods, and it's impossible to get them out. They don't make the food asur ki yesh matirus b'chol inyan. It's better to be machmir, and the shach sticks in that when we say that they fell into foods, l'maisa is we hold that toloim are batul b'roiv. They don't have to be batul b'shishim. So that's why they're easy to be in batul. The bugs that fell in, putting barrier shadows aside. Okay, I'm going to give you 1 minute, just for a minute, some of the highlights, or one version of some of the highlights of what happened by the Anisakis. Again, we're not really talking about it, even though you should if you learn Halacha Tesayin. Just some of the things that we talked back way back there. Everybody held, almost everybody except for the most radical people on each side of the debate, held that the Shulchan Aruch and the Gemara says that the worms in the flesh of fish are mutter. And the only reason to think about being machmir is because somehow we're going to prove that this is different. That the worm we're talking about is not the one that's here. Again, there were radical shittas on both sides of that thing, but within the mainstream shittas within that, everyone was saying it. Of course, the Gemara says it's mutter, and even so, we can somehow prove that this is not the same thing that the Gemara is talking about. Okay, of the proofs, there were two groups of proofs. Some of them were, if I could use the word circumstantial, which is like for example, we say there are lots of worms in the belly flap of the fish. It must be that they're coming from the stomach. Okay? That's circumstantial, which is, maybe that does prove it doesn't prove it. Maybe they're just there because they like to live in the belly flap. I'm not aware of that. The other is the piece of skin that covers the underside of the fish's belly. Okay, so they said there's so many worms in that part of the skin, it must be they're coming from the stomach. Why?
It's inside.
In the flesh. No, it's the skin of the flesh that covers the stomach on the underside of the fish.
Okay.
It's a certain piece of skin,
And the outside is on the inside.
It's not. It is the fish. It's not the inside or the outside. It's the fish's skin. The fish's.
Yeah, the color of the fish behind the belly flap.
Yeah. You have to cut it open. Yeah, if you cut open the fish, the underneath where the belly is a thinner layer of skin. Okay, now it's thicker on the top and it's thinner on the bottom underneath. Near the intestines, right? So they said as well, if they're there, then there must be they're coming from the intestines. Why are they only there? Not if they just grow in the flesh, they could be anyplace else. Well, maybe yes, maybe not. Maybe worms like to grow in that place, that place. It wasn't like a direct rule. So a number of them were like that, and then other ones, a whole bunch of other proofs were based on things. Our favorite topic, based on things that were done without your everyday kind of faculties of looking at things. Okay, with ultrasonic blue lights and microscopic things, all kinds of things that are not within our way we usually look at things, and which makes that some of them Oisrim were l'shitasei, okay, who are more willing to look at those kind of things, consider those kind of things than other people are. Okay, that's l'shitasei. In contrast, the Gemara, when it's trying to decide where the worms come from, the Gemara wants to know. When I told you the Gemara says the worms here are mutter and here are usher, the Gemara, I don't know if it's halacha l'mishasinai, but the Gemara doesn't say that's what it is. The Gemara says this: if the worm would be coming from the outside, it would have been a nimsa b'derech beis harei. Okay, the Gemara gives a very simple way of proving where the worm come from, because if it was coming from the outside, we would expect to see it over there, and we don't see it there, so it must be that it didn't come in like that. Because the Gemara gives a very simple, the Gemara didn't come in with guys in spacesuits in blue light. It wasn't, not that kind of way of looking at it. Okay. One of the most famous things that came out in that to do was the infamous tunnels, okay? They discovered tunnels in between the stomach of the fish and the flesh of the fish. And no one ever saw a worm going through the tunnel.
I thought he kindly did. So,
okay. Well, let's say so there are tunnels. He says, well, if there's tunnels, that's the way it goes. Maybe it's I should take that. I don't know what he said.
Either way, so come out.
Okay, so there's tunnels in between them. Okay, so the two things about the famous tunnels are, the infamous tunnels are, first of all, Hagar Sharidur talks about that. The Hagar Sharidur says, what happens if you see a fish, a worm going between the flesh and the stomach? You see it in between. You catch him in the act. He's passing through. He says, don't worry about it. He says, because you think if you see him passing through, he's going from the stomach into the flesh. He says, nah, he really went from the flesh into the stomach and now he's going back home. Okay, he just, don't think of him as going he came from the outside into the stomach into the flesh. No, he really was born in the flesh. He went into the stomach and now he's going back in. Okay, so he wasn't so perturbed by it.
Go that way, why can't he go the other way?
It's a very good question. I don't know what he says. I'm just saying this.
Maybe that guy could be the next guy. The next one.
The next guy, once the door's open. Good. Okay.
You can go past the tunnel. Wherever the tunnel stops, you can go further in.
Okay, therefore.
So
You mean, if we see that the tunnel ends over here, so then what is he doing an inch past there? How did he get there?
Then also, right, the king go from the intestines to the flesh.
Right? So the answer is, somehow, they're looking at it as that some of the Gemara holds that there's like an invisible wall. There's something magical that stops them from passing from here to here. But once you got through that, then who knows? It can move from this part of the flesh to this part. That was like it's just like somehow the Gemara they're looking at it, the Gemara somehow said, intestines, it can't pass that. Once it got past the line, then it's okay. Okay, but the other thing which is that there was a bit of, the Machmirim made a decision. Okay, and we don't have to talk about whether the decision was right or wrong. It's not so important. Well, we'll talk about it for a drop. But they made a decision, and that decision was the basis for everything that came afterwards. Okay, but that decision is not something that was told to most people. Okay, the decision was, when you heard that there were tunnels, and you heard that they saw them passing through V'cheina, they never saw, to my understanding, they never saw worms go from the intestines into the flesh. What they did see was worms going from let's get the word right, peritoneum into the flesh. Okay, what's a peritoneum? The fish's intestines are ball intestines. Those intestines are hanging in a cavity that's inside the fish. The fish's flesh is on the outside, and the intestines are hanging in a cavity. There's a lining on that cavity, and that's called the peritoneum. Okay, that's a lining of the cavity. So the lining is so to speak, between the intestines and the flesh. It's not exactly. It's really attached to the flesh. Okay, and the intestines are like hanging there, dangling there in the middle of this cavity, and on the inside of the flesh is this line that's there. So, what they saw was the tunnels, the moving, all those stuff that they saw was between the peritoneum and the flesh, not between the intestines and the flesh. So they said well, what's the status of this peritoneum? Is it flesh or is it intestines? Okay, so before I tell you, most of us would have said that it has the status of flesh. Why would we say it has the status of flesh? Because what's different about intestines than flesh? What's the difference? Why is intestines mutter and intestines also flesh is mutter? What's the reason for that? The reason is because the Gemara says the worm has a way to get into the intestines. It doesn't have a way to get into the flesh. Why is that? Well, because the animal's got an opening on two sides of the intestines, and there's ways to get into it. There's no way to get into the flesh. Okay, well, the openings into the intestines don't go to the peritoneum. Okay, it's like there's like a hose, and on the outside of the hose, you can't get to the outside. How are you going to get to there? The same svara that the Gemara thinks of why it can't get into the flesh applies to the peritoneum also. The svara is the same. The flesh it's like a long pipe. You can't get into the outside. How do you get to the peritoneum in that general area, but it's on the wrong side of the wall? Okay, so they have a diak in one of the achronim that peritoneum should be considered intestines. The male, they decided that's considered intestines. So they said, well, now if it went from there into the flesh, it went from the intestines into the flesh. Okay, but that decision then was the basis for many other proofs that came afterwards. That decision was not. Most people did not catch the subtlety of that decision that they made. Nor did they tell it to most people. Okay, you have to dig really deep to find out that piece of information. And it's a very important piece of information because if you say that thing is flesh, which is the Pasha said that is flesh, then a lot of the things that they have to say didn't amount to it as much. Okay, and lastly, we're really over time. I'm sorry. Lastly is that the reason why Anisakis became so famous and they know so much about it is because there's a huge amount of scientific research about it for health reasons. Science has done a lot of research into this worm, and people's question is that if you did this much research into every other worm, would you not find similar pieces of similar information to the point that the Shulchan said there is a case that's mutter. If not every case, at least in certain cases of mutter. Where's the case that's mutter? In this case, they say no, this one is different. This one is only you know a lot about it because there's a lot of research about it. The question whether that is or not. Okay. Anyhow, if you want to get all the gory details, you can listen to this year, and we'll go on mission to next time to something else.